You're listening to the Talking Headways Podcast Network. This is Talking Headways, a weekly podcast about sustainable transportation and urban design. I'm Jeff Wood. This week we're joined by Yale Law professor David Schleicher to talk about his new book, In a Bad State, Responding to State and Local Budget Crises. We chat about how fiscal historic crises shape similar responses today and how infrastructure funding plays out in the United States. Stay with us. Worldwide, 1.35 million people die in traffic-related crashes each year. Half those deaths are pedestrians and cyclists. The Street Project is an inspiring story about a massive movement across the world to reclaim our largest public spaces, our streets. To learn more or to host a screening of the Street Project in your community, visit thestreetproject.com. That's thestreetproject.com. Today's podcast is brought to you by our wonderful, amazing Patreon supporters. Your support is critical to Talking Headways and Mondays at the Overhead Wire. We really appreciate it. To join this gang of zoning misfits and transportation rabble-rousers, go to patreon.com/theoverheadwire. $2 a month gets you some stickers and a handwritten note. $10 a month gets you one of our transportation scarves. Thanks so much to everybody who supports the show, from the bus drivers to the advocates all around the world. That's patreon.com/theoverheadwire. And for more information on our work and where to find our daily newsletter, the transportation scarves, our Cars Are Cholesterol merch, buy books from the authors that join us on the show at our bookshop affiliate site, or find our audiobook version of Raymond Unwin's Town Planning and Practice, check out the show notes on your podcatcher or visit theoverheadwire.com. Hey everyone, thanks for listening to the Talking Headways podcast, especially through your podcatchers. With the unfortunate news that Stitcher will stop operations on August 29th, we hope you'll continue to listen on other services. You can find us on Spotify, iHeartRadio, SoundCloud, Apple Podcasts, Overcast, Pocket Cast, TuneIn, and many, many more. We'll put our RSS feed in the show notes if that helps you make the switch. Thanks again for listening to Talking Headways. We really do appreciate it, especially those of you who keep coming back each and every week. Well, David Schleicher, welcome to the Talking Headways podcast.
Thank you so much for having me.
Of course. Thanks for being here. Before we get started, can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yeah. So I am a law professor. I teach at Yale, and I study land use, local development. And in this case, I've been working a lot on municipal finance, both local tax policy, federalism as it relates to this, and the municipal bond market and things like that.
And how did you get into cities initially? Like, was it something that happened when you were a young kid, or was it something that you learned about later on?
Yeah. So I grew up in Manhattan, New York, not Manhattan, Kansas. Unlike the more famous Manhattan. I would say my parents both worked for municipal unions in New York City, and I kind of grew up in politics. I mean, not like directly electoral politics, but like involved in government somehow, my family. And I was really interested in questions like local politics. And I've written a lot about local elections, which you may see in the last chapter of the book, which we're going to talk about in a minute. But a lot of my scholarship's been about local elections. But I also got really interested in urban economics, as New York was going through a big period of transition at that moment, going from the 12 years old, or between 12 and 14 during the height of the murder epidemic in New York. My high school years were the early beginning of the gentrification or kind of economic boom part of New York City's history, a recent history. And so the questions of urban economics kind of also always interested me from a young age. And after college, I went to get a master's degree in economics, and I studied urban there. And then by the time I got to law school, I kind of combined these interests into studying local government law.
Well, that leads us to your book, In a Bad State, Responding to State and Local Budget Crises. What was kind of the impetus to write this book?
So it's a great question. So, a couple of things. One, I'd say that generally speaking, the federal government, which people spend most of their energy, if they think about politics, thinking about, doesn't actually do very much. The old joke about the federal government is that it is an insurance company with a military. That is to say, it provides health insurance and old age insurance in the form of Social Security, and has an army, and then it provides money to state and local governments, but it doesn't actually operate very much. And if you look at our most important government services, they're either entirely funded or partially funded and almost entirely operated by state and local governments. And so whether it's Medicaid, which is partially a mixed cooperative federalism program between states and the federal government, whether it's policing, which is largely a local function, schools, which is almost entirely funded by state and local taxes and are operated obviously by local governments from school districts. So studying local finance seemed really, really, really important and much understudied. And then secondarily, the period in which I started getting interested, it was a period of real shock to state and local finances. So the period after the Great Recession is a period of extreme local retrenchment in number of people who work for local governments. There's huge cuts. You start seeing these, you see these kind of well-known bankruptcies in Detroit and whatever you want to call Puerto Rico, quasi-bankruptcy. And so that's kind of where I started to get interested in it. And right now we're at a really interesting period for state and local budgets. Say the last number of years have been some of the best years in the history of state and local budgets. So the late 2010s were an economically growing period, and state and local budgets are pro-cyclical. That is to say, they get more money when the economy is good and have to make cuts when the economy is bad. And that has some macroeconomic implications, but it's also just a fact. And so when the economy was growing really well, so were state and local budgets. And then they faced a shock during COVID, but it was a smaller shock than people expected due to the way the economy happened. And the federal government threw, I think, what can only be described as boatloads of money at states and cities and other local governments. As a result, it's been a real boom time for state and local budgets. But right now, we're starting to see the situation change. State and local revenues are starting to fall and are projected to fall more, particularly in places that are heavily income tax dependent, like New York and California and Illinois. And then relatedly, the federal money is stopping. So we're starting to see it run out, the money that was approved during COVID. And a little bit of it was actually pulled back during the debt deal, the debt limit deal. And so we're at a moment when state and local, rather than being in a boom period, we're going to be in a period of retrenchment for state and local budgets. And so I think it's worth a good time to start thinking about the problems of state and local budget crises.
You talk about the history. I mean, these two time periods that we're talking about, the Great Recession and COVID, are kind of rare in history, it seems like. And something that you kind of call out in the book that I was really fascinated by was kind of the history of some other bankruptcies and debt crises that happened that kind of led to where we are today and how people dealt with the Great Recession and COVID. And I'm wondering if you could give me a kind of a sense of the process there from early on, from Hamilton all the way to currently in a short form, because obviously you go through it deep in the book, but I think it's fascinating to think about all the steps that it took to get to where we are today.
So to start, like the idea that some state and local governments would face financial crises or inability to pay their debt or have difficulty paying their debt it should seem pretty inevitable. We have 50 states and thousands of local governments. And the idea that some of them are going to have crises some of the time just seems pretty likely. And in fact, the problem of state and local governments facing crises and the cost that imposes not just on them, but on other jurisdictions has been an ongoing part of American history. As you noted from the first Congress, Hamilton's plan to assume state debts, I'm not going to rap along with I promise. But that was a situation in which state and local governments had a lot of difficulty paying the Revolutionary War debts, and the federal government bailed them out. We saw in other periods, the federal government decided not to do that. So in the 1840s, people expected the federal government to bail them out. And in fact, their British and Dutch investors particularly expected it, but they didn't. And 8 states and a territory defaulted. And states have defaulted in the 1840s and the 1870s. Arkansas defaulted in 1930. In fact, Arkansas defaults in all 3 of those periods. I jokingly call it the American Argentina. And then if you want to go to local governments, we've had lots and lots of periods of big local government defaults. So from during the 1860s and through the 1890s, there were hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of local defaults, many of which the question of the enforcement of the bonds made to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court heard more cases about municipal bond defaults than it heard on any other topic. And in other periods, you have the famous New York City fiscal crisis in the 1970s. And so these issues have kind of spanned across American history because, first of all, we just have so many local governments, and particularly because we assign to local governments a lot of responsibilities, particularly investing in infrastructure that rely on them borrowing.
And that kind of goes into the idea of the trilemma, right? So thinking about the 3 major pegs on the stool, as it were, of things that can go wrong or right to a certain extent, and why actually the federal government has an interest in actually maybe sometimes bailing out states and cities.
Yeah. So the central analytical point of the book is that when faced with a state or local budget crisis, the federal government has 3 things it would like to achieve, but it can't achieve all 3. It can only achieve 2 of those 3 things. And so what are the 3 things it wants to achieve? It wants to avoid kind of really sharp budget cuts or austerity, because that state and local fiscal crises generally happen during recessions, and budget cuts during recessions are bad. Secondly, it wants to avoid moral hazard. That is to say, if it bails the government out, then the government may grow to expect it, and that will lead to greater budget problems in the future. And then third thing is it wants to avoid harm to the municipal bond market. Why would anyone care about that? Well, state and local governments, we rely on them to build almost all infrastructure in America. And in order to do so, they need to be able to borrow. And so if a jurisdiction defaults, people will lend that jurisdiction less money and all other jurisdictions less money. They'll become more skeptical of jurisdiction. And so the federal government wants to avoid that problem because it relies so much on state and local governments to invest in infrastructure. And as a result, the federal government has a couple of policy tools, but it can't achieve all three of these ends. So if it does a bailout, it creates moral hazard. If it makes jurisdictions pay their debts and doesn't do a bailout, that means austerity. That means vast budget cuts. And then alternatively, if it encourages default, which it can do in a variety of ways, it avoids moral hazard and avoids the worst of austerity, but at the same time harms the municipal bond market and harms the future ability of that jurisdiction and other jurisdictions to borrow to build infrastructure. So it's got three choices. None of them are that good. And it kind of, over time, we've kind of moved between each of these policies.
And that's an interesting part of the book, too, is talking about the moving between and how the Supreme Court changed their mind at some point about what was important and why. And so, we were talking about things like infrastructure, which is something that obviously listeners are interested in, and thinking about things like the Erie Canal and why that was kind of an important benchmark. And so that's interesting, the ebb and flow over time of what was important to, say, the Supreme Court, which actually acted as a policy arm to a certain extent for a very long time.
Yeah, not only for different times, but about different jurisdictions. So one of my favorite juxtapositions in the book is during the 1870s, there were two separate debt crises, the 1870s and 1880s. One is about local governments. And local governments had invested a huge amount in building railroads, basically subsidizing railroads, and it created a lot of them defaulted. The railroad companies coming to these different towns to try to convince them to invest in their railroads to get the railroad to come down. I know the book actually had a lot in common with the famous monorail episode of The Simpsons. They're going around convincing them all the time. But this led to a lot of defaults. And the Supreme Court was faced with the question, like, how hard should it push to force governments to pay back these debts? And it pushed really hard. It made up all sorts of laws. It would allow other federal courts to send marshals to kind of make jurisdictions raise taxes in order, even if kind of in violation of their own charters, to pay back their debts. And this was really costly. So like on one hand, they're enforcing debts, they're creating austerity. The austerity created real economic harms. On the other hand, because it preserved the municipal bond market for cities, particularly northern and eastern cities, it allowed those jurisdictions to borrow going forward. And we have this grand period of infrastructural development in the 1880s, 1890s, where American cities end up having much better infrastructure than any cities elsewhere in the world. Like Buffalo had better water mains and better streetcars than London did. It was, On the other hand, after the end of Reconstruction, almost all southern states defaulted on their debt. And the Supreme Court made up law in a different direction, kind of creating our modern sovereign immunity law in order to allow those jurisdictions not to pay their debts. The debts were incurred largely by mixed race Reconstruction era governments, and the newly empowered all white governments decided they didn't want to pay those debts. And the Supreme Court said, sure thing, allowing them to avoid those debts. And that allowed them to avoid short-term economic harm. On the other hand, it meant they couldn't borrow going forwards. And so if you wonder why infrastructure in the South really isn't as developed as it is in the North, well, there are a couple of reasons for that. But one of the reasons is that during the kind of key period of American infrastructural development, they were largely barred from bond markets. And that was like really limited their ability to invest and grow.
One of the notes I have here is overbuilding rail lines causes a lot of defaults and pain, but also strengthen the municipal bond market. Yay, capitalism?
It's a great question. But railroads are, first of all, like capitalism here is a very complicated concept because it's capitalism with a huge amount of government subsidies.
Right.
But railroads as a business are particularly prone to boom and bust because they have high fixed costs. Like you have to build a railroad, but then they have low operating costs. And so the result can be if you develop a bunch of kind of railroad lines along the same lines, like near one another, the costs will go down and they'll be too low to cover your fixed costs. And so railroads everywhere are subject to these huge boom and busts, absent regulation. So the thing we developed later was a system of price regulation for railroad that has consisted and kind of gotten very complicated over time. But the one thing I'll say about this is that capitalism is complicated, but the idea that governments would invest a huge amount in infrastructure, huge amounts in infrastructure, is compared to including subsidizing private development of infrastructure. But if you look back at, say, the last 20 years, you can look back and say, where are our infrastructural marvels? The period after the Great Recession should have been this period where we built a ton of infrastructure, right? Interest rates are low, unemployment is high. Where are our high-speed rail? Whereas if you look back 100 years before, we had quite a lot of it.
Yeah, it's a really interesting kind of time period. And just, I guess from that idea, there's like this big debt collection circus too that was happening at the time, I feel like, from all the bonds that were created.
Oh, the stories are hilarious. I mean, some
Yeah.
of them are amazing. So it's like one thing is that when towns in Iowa refused to pay their debts, President Grant, this is 1870, President Grant, General Grant, threatens to send the Union Army, 5 years after the end of the Civil War, to the staunch Union state of Iowa in order to enforce municipal bonds. That's how serious this was. But that's not the funny part. The funny things are the things that jurisdictions tried to do to get out of paying their debts. I'll tell two stories. One is that the Supreme Court made this extremely strange distinction, which is they said that federal courts couldn't order jurisdictions to raise taxes, but they could order officials to raise taxes. So what jurisdictions started doing was holding their public meetings in secret, so that marshals couldn't find them to make them pay taxes, to which marshals then responded by hiding. And so one would hide as the town drunk and go to towns and pretend to be the town drunk and then serve papers and say, you have to raise taxes right now. The other really funny story is that a couple of states started doing something called corporate suicide. And that doesn't sound funny, but it is a little funny, I'd say. And this comes in front of the Supreme Court in a case involving Mobile, Alabama. Mobile couldn't pay its debts. And so the state created a new city called Port of Mobile, new local government, and reassigned the power to tax property in Mobile from the city of Mobile to this new city, Port of Mobile. And then Port of Mobile bought the city of Mobile's assets. And then creditors were left suing the old city of Mobile, which had no assets and no taxing power. The Supreme Court declared that was unconstitutional, but doesn't actually explain why. Just like that can't be. This corporate suicide thing can't be. Denouement of that story is that a variety of types of tools that modern financiers have created for cities and states kind of draw on a similar idea. And so this started in New York City, but kind of maybe more notably recently, it happened in Puerto Rico, where jurisdictions take their sales tax revenues and give it to a different set of bondholders. And they said they're heavily indebted. They say, new bondholders, if you give us money, you can have all of our sales tax revenue. In theory, this assignment would win in a bankruptcy. And the old bondholders are left saying, what the heck? Right? We expected our investment to be backed not just by income taxes, but also by sales taxes. And the question of whether those types of assignments, which in Puerto Rico go under the title of COFINA, but New York City went under the idea of Big Mac bonds, is legal, is a direct descendant of that question from Port of Mobile.
How many times did you think you would write haircut in a book?
I wrote haircut in a book a lot. How many times I thought, I don't know. But haircut is the term, that kind of somewhat not technical term, for the amount a creditor takes off when a jurisdiction faces bankruptcy or default or whatever. And the idea is that you're owed $100. You take a haircut of $5 to pay if you get 95 cents on the dollar. And so in, say, the Detroit bankruptcy, bondholders took a variety of types of haircuts from none at all to 70%. And pensioners took haircuts below that. So how many times I think I'd write it? I don't know. I do like getting haircuts. So maybe more times than I needed to.
Haircuts for hair, but not haircuts for your bonds.
Yes.
Okay, I'm going to ask a question, and I'm not sure if it's a good one or a bad one, and you can tell me whether this makes sense or not. Okay. So I was reading this, and I was thinking about the transfer of wealth in transportation. And you mentioned how expensive transportation costs were in the late 19th century, which made firms more likely to agglomerate to get lower costs. And then at the time, personal transportation costs were kind of a low percentage of income, somewhere around something like 2%, I think is what Scott Bernstein says. But after the interstates were built, that flipped on its head. And so shipping costs are low, but personal transportation costs are incredibly high, just below 20% of personal income. So I'm wondering if there's a connection between the allowance of local infrastructure investment through these bond decisions and the shifting of who pays most for transportation costs.
That's a great question. So it's actually even bigger than you say, because the cost of personal transportation is not just like the cost of your car, but it's the cost of your time. Right. So the fact that you're sitting in your commute means you're not working. This is like one of the reasons why people like working from home, is they have more hours to work. And so did the investment in infrastructure lead to people spending more time traveling? So the answer is probably yes, almost certainly yes. That is to say that particularly the building of the interstate highways and the building of roads allowed people to spread out further, which meant they were less concentrated and they'd spend more time traveling. And so the answer is yes, although they got something in return, which is that they were able to, first of all, like basically without that infrastructure investment, we don't have the development of the suburbs, which you can bemoan, but also like a lot of people seem to like. and resulted in both it being possible for people to move from the farms to somewhere else, and then particularly and allowed for people to have more property in which they could live. And so it is the case that modern infrastructure, particularly road infrastructure, allowed for the spreading out of cities, which had some good and some bad effects.
I'm just thinking about the CNT kind of model of housing plus transportation costs and how kind of those flip on their heads. And if you think about how much, time and how much mortgages, you get to your 30% mortgage or less. And so you have to drive further, drive till you qualify, I guess is the way to say it. And so I'm just thinking about those kind of connections and how cities grew.
Yeah. I mean, there are a lot of other things happening in that story too, right? Mm-hmm. So limits on urban building through land use controls play a pretty substantial role. But I mean, I think it's that the reason people drive until they qualify is that they want more property.
Space.
Right, and more space. And they also want to live in, many people, and we're both city people, so it's a slightly different story, but want to live in jurisdictions that will exclude other people, right? So they want to be able to control, to keep their public schools exclusive and allow for racial segregation. And so there are a lot of pieces to that story, but I don't know that I would say that infrastructure investment is bad because it leads to people being able to spread out. That type of logic would equally apply to commuter train lines, which also allowed people, right? And so it's one of these things, it creates benefits and costs. But I'd say in general, I think that we kind of looking at modern America, we view our infrastructure as insufficiently invested in and also too expensive to build separately. But some of the downsides you're noting, I think could be pretty easily mitigated, or not easily, but could be mitigated through other policy changes.
It was just something I thought about when I was reading the book, because I was like, oh, these things kind of connect a little bit.
Oh, it's a great point. I mean, the only other thing is that, if you think more broadly about canals and other things, or explain why cities are where they are. Almost all American cities are built along ports, along rivers, and along railroad connections. And that's because they were places where, when shipping costs were high, firms wanted to locate right next to places where they could ship final goods. And so, why is Chicago a city? Well, Chicago is a city because it was at a key node of connecting the Mississippi River to the Great Lakes, which then connected to New York and the things through the Erie Canal. And that explains why Chicago is a thing. And so in order to understand the history of location in America, but everywhere in the world, you also have to understand the history of infrastructural development.
Do you think that the president and Congress acted differently from the Great Recession to the pandemic because of lessons learned from the trilemma impacts?
100%. How did they act differently? So after the Great Recession, if you remember, the Obama stimulus bill was real and it provided some money to states, but it provided, after a while, it ran out, particularly after Republicans took over Congress. And the effect of that was that it stimulated the economy less, but particularly one of the big ways it stimulated the economy less was by not giving a lot of money to state and local governments. And state and local governments reduced their employment. So we don't see meeting the 2008 level of public employment until 2019. So it's a huge period of decline in state and local employment. And this is one of the reasons the Great Recession was great, that private employment comes back to between pre-2008 periods in 2012. But you don't see public employment and then overall total employment come back until much later than that. And that is a huge reason why the Great Recession was a great recession and not just a pretty bad recession. But over the course of COVID, the federal government gave a huge amount of stimulus. And particularly the last bit, the ARP under Biden, was explicitly thought of as a way of avoiding the pullback that we saw in 2008. That's to say, where you provide stimulus, but then you didn't keep providing stimulus. The economy was rough. The stimulus provided in the ARP, a lot of it went directly to state and local government. So some of the earlier things in CARES Act did as well, as did some of the other bills as well, but gave a lot of money to state and local governments. So much so that most economists agree that the amounts were so big that it contributed to inflation. So the stimulus was so effective, it contributed to inflation. The other thing that is notable about the way the ARP money, the CARES Act money, although not notably the municipal liquidity facility created by the Federal Reserve, was it went to all states. And why would you give money to all states? One of the reasons you would do so is to avoid moral hazard. That is to say, if you're going to give money to everyone, it still creates some moral hazard, but the particular problem of moral hazard is that you've got an incentive to run your state budget into the ground because you know you're going to get bailed out by the federal government. And if you're giving money to everybody, then that concern is diminished pretty substantially. And so I would say the concerns along the trilemma really dramatically affected the shape of the federal government's post-COVID response.
Do you think it was helpful to, because we did see that the economy came back to a certain extent because of the individual stimulus checks and PPP and all those other things. Do you think it was necessary to give money to states and local governments?
Yeah. So giving money to states and cities is one of the most potent forms of stimulus you have because state and local governments spend all the money they got. And so in that way, state and local governments are like poor individuals. They're not saving. I mean, they save a little bit. They should save more. So it's a very potent form of stimulus, and it keeps people employed a lot like the PPP program did. And so I think giving money to states and cities was probably a good idea. It probably should have been a little less, but it was a good idea. But I think they should have taken steps to reduce some of the harms that it created. Specifically, I think they should have attached to the stimulus money greater conditions to encourage states and cities to budget more responsibly going forward. It was a moment of great leverage over states and cities, and they should have included with the money some conditions to encourage greater budget responsibility going forward. And I think that kind of pairing would have understood the problems that are posed by the trilemma better.
Here's another crazy connection that I made in my head. I did this a lot in your book, which I'm really happy about because it made me think. At the same time, right before the pandemic, over the pandemic, HQ2 was a big deal. And so stimulus from governments to private actors is a big topic of discussion, especially in the work from home era. So we have this, do we subsidize companies or do we subsidize individuals? And so a lot of cities actually like Tulsa and others are trying to subsidize individuals. And I wonder if there's a connection between the two.
Yeah. I mean, subsidies, I think, are a really interesting subject. They're a pretty small percentage of overall local governmental spending or state governmental spending. I mean, they're a big deal at the level of the individual company.
Right.
They're also, this is the kind of thing you could have imagined creating conditions on, which is something it would be a little more complicated, but to limit this type of intergovernmental competition for, if we're going to give you money, don't spend it on attracting, the Oakland A's to leave for Las Vegas, just for example. So figuring out how to deal with that problem of interjurisdictional competition is really a hard problem to solve in a world where states and cities are fiscally independent. And there's some interesting ideas out there. And you could have imagined the federal government doing something on that score. Now, one last thing, like the Tulsa subsidizing individuals, it's just mostly silly. It's the interesting thing, there are very few good arguments for subsidizing firms to move to town. It's definitely bad globally, and it's usually even bad locally. It doesn't work out. One of the arguments is that, well, if we get this firm there, it will produce more in taxes over time. The logic of that would be not subsidizing normal people, but would be getting super, super rich people to move to town. So the thing that is like getting HQ2 to town, it would be like giving Taylor Swift a bunch of money to move to town. Now, jurisdictions don't do that. At least they don't say they do that because it would be super gross and people would be angry. But the idea that giving someone $10,000 once and then they're going to move and then they're going to stay there forever. I mean, if they're going to respond to the money, maybe they'll leave again in a year. I mean, who knows? It's the evidence for these things is not great. I mean, you never know. And one of the great things about having so many local governments is you get to see some experimentation, but it's pretty dumb and bad.
Let's talk a bit about Chapter 9, bankruptcy. There's some that argue that it should be extended to states. Chapter 9 is the process for which cities can do bankruptcy in the United States. And we're seeing these transit agencies and the fiscal cliffs that they're coming about. I'm wondering if that's a solution for some of them as well, if something happens where they can drop off the cliff and are insolvent.
Well, transit agencies can if a state gives the transit agency the right to file, so for governments to file for bankruptcy, local governments, they have to get direct state authorization. And a court determines that it's insolvent. A transit agency federal law already allows for transit agencies to file for insolvency for under Chapter 9. And it's completely plausibly a response to some transit agency crises. It would be legal. Transit agencies are facing, as you noted, extreme fiscal pressure. The fare box recovery ratios are way, way, way down just because fewer people are riding, but yet the cost of operating the trains is continual. And they have a lot of legacy costs, and particularly pensions for public workers. And so it is a plausible place for having bankruptcy. I mean, I'm not like saying, yes, Bart is going to file for bankruptcy tomorrow, but like it's not crazy to think that would happen. Notably, New York's Metropolitan Transit Authority got a special loan from the Federal Reserve during the crisis, which highlights that it was one of the most hard-struck jurisdictions during COVID. So yes, I'm a big fan of bankruptcy as a tool. I think it should be extended to states. But in addition to that, the merits of it are conditional on situation. But transit agencies are in many ways it would allow them to break their collective bargaining agreements. One of the problems we see with transit agencies is not necessarily that they can't operate a good service for the amount of state money, but just that they were built for an era in which ridership was higher than it is right now. As you saw in California, this is going to entail much more state spending to keep them afloat. And states may be able to do that. And I hope they can. I very much like transit agencies and I like transit.
Yeah, right.
But, in a world in which fewer people are riding it, because fewer people are commuting to downtowns, and these train systems are generally built in order to get people from the suburbs to downtowns, it's completely possible that that won't happen, and that bankruptcy might be a good tool for allowing some, rather than having all of the harms be borne by reduced service, by allowing some of the harms to be borne by bondholders and pensioners.
Yeah. I think they'll be back at some point. I think they just need to buy more time. I think that's the key at the moment. But who knows if it's going to end up in bankruptcy.
That's the thing. Like, I hope so, right?
Yeah.
But that requires some sets of beliefs. One is about what's going to happen with work from home. And I don't know, people have lots of predictions, but what they are is predictions. They're not.
Yeah.
Right. And the second thing is it depends a little bit on whether they have to make cuts now that make the service less attractive in the future. Right. So that if your response to this is what people call the doom loop. Sometimes we talk about the doom loop for San Francisco, but we also talk about the doom loop for transit agencies. If you cut services because your budget's down, then people find your services less attractive and they get cars and they whatever, And so, I don't think you can avoid there being real risks. I'm hopeful. Always. I'm a regular New York City subway rider. You have to be hopeful, but it's certainly, there are a lot of risks out there for transit agencies.
What kind of ticking time bomb are these underfunded pensions that you mentioned?
Yeah, so underfunded pensions are, I think, a widely misunderstood part of local finance. If anyone thinks about it at all, they are misunderstood. So people generally think of underfunded pensions as a problem created by expensive pensions. That is to say, the reason we have underfunded pensions is that public workers are living high on the hog with big pensions. You can have any belief you want about the size of pensions and the size of deferred compensation relative to present compensation for public workers, but that's not why we've underfunded pensions. Plenty of jurisdictions have very expensive pensions, but also are relatively fully funded. So New York State, for instance, has some of the most expensive public pensions in America, but also has very well-funded pensions. So what are underfunded pensions? Instead, they're just debt. That is to say, jurisdictions, instead of balancing their budgets, and one part of balancing your budget is paying your workers their salaries right now, and what the amount of money it takes to pay for a police officer or a teacher is not only the present compensation, but the amount of money you're putting away for their retirement. What underfunded pension is basically the debt that's caused by running a deficit. That is to say, not paying a worker. And that the reason they are in pension funds is that it's a good place to hide them. You have two benefits for a government that wants to hide a deficit. Generally, they have legal obligations to keep a balanced budget and limits on how much debt they can issue. One is that you can just lie pretty easily. You can say, we expect to get a 9%, 8% return on our investments. And the second thing is that for the most part, for balanced budget amendments and for legal debt limits, pensions don't count. They're kept outside of that. And that is a legal decision, but it's one that treats two different types of obligations you absolutely have to pay very differently. And so in the post-Great Recession period, a lot of borrowing went in the form of underfunding pensions. And so as opposed to cutting budgets even further at that period when it would have been really, really, really painful to do so, but one of the effects of that is that a lot of the borrowing capacity of jurisdictions is in these underfunded pensions as opposed to being invested in new infrastructure. And that's costly and be it. So how big a ticking time bomb? Well, it's just debt. And so it depends on the jurisdiction of how big their overall debt loads are, including public pensions, but also including bonded debt and other healthcare obligations.
I find that really interesting because you don't really hear people, you hear people talk about pensions and, the underfunding part and how are you going to pay for this and all that stuff. But basically it's your own lending machine to a certain extent, and you can fund it to the extent that you wish to and use it in your budgeting. And I think that's really interesting kind of way to think about it.
Yeah, it is. On the other hand, it's not like you can avoid paying it. You have a legal obligation under the state constitution to pay your pensions. And so you can borrow from it the way you could also borrow from the market. Now, we frequently, when a government seeks to borrow, we frequently make them ask the voters to do so, right? So have you voted in a bond election before?
Of course.
Yeah, right. Yeah, right. And so like that's a normal part. Oh, again, you're in California, you vote for everything.
Yes, we do. Too much.
You vote for the size of chicken coops. You vote for everything out there. But bond elections are a way of restricting government borrowing, right? So the idea is the government can't just borrow what it wants. It has to ask the voters if it wants to borrow. But when they want to borrow basically from the future in the same way that bonded debt is, if they do it through the pension funds, we don't make them. And so when politicians are faced with the choice of, should I go to the voters and ask for debt? Or should I not go to the voters and just lie and say I'm going to get a 9% return?
Yeah. And it was interesting recently in Texas where, basically their light rail line, they had an election and they voted to say yes to this big expansion. But then the funding mechanism was them creating a special entity. And then the currently impeached Ken Paxton came out right before he was impeached, actually saying like, oh, well, this isn't legal under state law. You can't just transfer money that you use for bonds into the light rail, this company that you created for light rail. And so there's all these sticky questions about how you fund infrastructure in different ways and trying to kind of, not cook the books, but like rearrange and pull things around and things like that.
Oh, almost all American public, like we mostly fund mass transit through public authorities. We fund a lot of things through public authorities. And why would we create a public authority that's like New York's MTA to run our infrastructure? Well, there are a couple of reasons why you'd want to do it. One is maybe you don't think the voters should be voting directly on this kind of thing. I disagree with that, but some people think, on the other hand, one of the reasons is it allows you to get past your debt limits. One of the reasons we have authorities is they are remote from debt limits. That is to say, they're a different government. And so debt limits that would apply to a city or county wouldn't apply if the state legislature just creates a new government called a public authority. And public authorities are generally doubly remote because they generally rely on revenue bonds rather, that is to say, bonds backed by particular revenue sources like fares or tolls. And so the history of authorities and the history of mass transit is very much one that's all about debt limits and things like revenue bonds. And so people who are interested in mass transit or in infrastructure more broadly, that is to say, listeners of this wonderful podcast, like really should spend a lot more time thinking about these tools of public finance because they're part of the story.
It reminds me of the story you told about Detroit, too, where some of the folks had to take a haircut, but then the school system got bailed out and the separation of government.
Yeah, that's a crazy story and something, one of the reforms I suggest in the book. But it's so Detroit School District is coterminous with the city of Detroit. Let's say it's the same area, but it's a separate government. And that's a very frequent, you see that sometimes in big cities. And so when Detroit goes bankrupt, Detroit School District just gets a lot of money from the state. And so teachers get 100 cents of their pension, 100 cents of their dollar, they have full pensions, but police officers didn't. And people who lent money to the people of Detroit through their school district got 100 cents of the dollars, but people who lent money to the people of Detroit through the city government got much less than that. I think that's a bad result for a couple of reasons, but one of them is that like there's a declining marginal harms to any cuts, right? So if you're going to cut something, like the first thing you cut from your budget is not perfectly essential, but the 900th thing you cut is going to be really, really, really painful. And so one of the things we've done in the way we deal with bankruptcy and deal with it is that we often locate it all in one government, even though they're overlapping governments that then are able to survive. And so the result is that they don't make the somewhat easier cuts. I don't want to diminish the harms felt by the Detroit School District, but the declining marginal harms here suggests, and I think it's a pretty strong argument, that it would be better if all the overlapping governments were treated the same, that is to say, plunge into bankruptcy at the same time if one of them was going to go into bankruptcy.
I just found that really fascinating. Let's talk about climate change, shall we?
We're already in light topics. I mean, it's the fun stuff.
Well, I think one of the ways that your book might be used, unfortunately, in the future is because of insurance. And let me explain. State Farm just left Florida and California. And the reason why is because of hazards from climate change, whether that's fires, hurricanes, flooding, those types of things. And I read a piece the other day, and I can't remember the name of the blog, unfortunately. It'll be in the show notes, I'm sure. But basically, they were saying like the same things that you were. We're talking about the trilemma, and the real estate values of these places are very high, and people want to have them insured. And so the state eventually, because all these insurance companies are pulling out, the state is likely to have backfill that. And then after one or two disasters, the state is going to enter the bankruptcy or the hurt locker to a certain extent. I was thinking about that when I was reading your book and thinking this book is likely to be used at some point, maybe because of climate change and hazards, not moral hazards necessarily, a moral hazard, but also natural hazards.
Yeah, no, I mean, so the thing that causes economic shocks changes over time. So one of the reasons Detroit has a financial crisis is because it suffers a long-run economic decline. Why does it suffer a long-run economic decline? Well, there are a number of reasons, but there are things like firms moving to the South to get better labor law for their car factories, or kind of increased trade competition from Japan for cars, or whatever else. And so there are shocks. Again, the economy has all sorts of shifts, and that's true for natural disasters too, right? So when we face an acute natural disaster, the federal government usually just gives people a boatload of money. And that, in the case of climate change, creates real crises. So we frequently rebuild areas that suffer floods, even though we oughtn't, because the federal government responds to floods by giving places a bunch of money, even though they're on places that are very, very likely to suffer floods in the future. Now, the story about property insurance in California, particularly, and Florida, they're a slightly different story. One of the reasons firms are pulling out of California is not just that there are likely to be shocks, but that the cost of building things in California is so high. So if a house gets knocked down, the cost of rebuilding it is not just that it will be knocked down again due to further climate change-related natural disasters, but also that the cost of building it is so high. And so California, you're going to be negative as one of the things that I would hope to see is that California respond to the fact that it is acting as an insurer, or increasingly acting as an insurer, or helping the reinsurance market work by making policy changes that would make it cheaper to rebuild housing, because it will acknowledge that one of the reasons it's so expensive to insure property is that you have to pay for the cost of rebuilding it, and if rebuilding it is so expensive. And so there are a whole variety of policy changes you can imagine there. Now, one last thing, like this is obvious, the effects of climate change, the property insurance market is only one of a variety of, like sometimes it's much more direct. They literally flood, right? Or they burn, or you can't breathe.
Yeah.
This is going to have pretty dramatic effects on lots of jurisdictions. When these economic shocks hit places, the federal government will face this difficult choice if those jurisdictions have fiscal crises. It's definitely a real possibility.
Yeah, I think this connected. I think the people are going to have to read your book because of it.
I encourage them to read the book, whatever reason it is that they.
I do too. I think it's really fascinating.
First of all, I encourage them to buy the book. Whether they read it, I hope they read it too. But first, you got to buy it.
You want them to be the people that buy the books at the bookstore and then they sit on their shelves forever? No, we want them to read it.
I mean, I want them to read it too, but buying it is also really important. I just want to say it's both. It's read it and buy it. Buy it and read it.
This kind of like the last theme here is the press. And you mentioned the impact of shrinking press on partisan voting trends, and that parties often act as a proxy for a lot of issues. And that gets really messy locally, and especially here in California. I saw an article the other day. I was talking about the uniparty of California. And I was like, if you were here, you would realize that it might be blue in a presidential election, but there's people all over the map on that blue side coming from different angles. And so I was really thinking about how that does impact how state and local governments are run. And we do have to fix overall state and local politics, like you say in the book. But how do we fix this? Like, how do we fix the attention paid to state and local politics as opposed to just this overall national discussion that we constantly have and wait for every 4-year presidential elections? And, do we have education campaigns? Do we have every election in November, which we just changed in San Francisco? We're going to have November elections for the mayor. And also another thing that I know you have some answers to is, how do we bring down transit construction costs by fixing all these local and state problems?
Yeah, I'll get to the construction cost. It's a great question. I don't know. Have you had Alon on the pod, or Eric? You might have. I don't know.
I had Alon on a long time ago,
yeah.
But we also had the folks from Eno too on the show to talk about stuff.
Yeah, they're great too. Anyway, I'll leave that to them. I mean, I have some thoughts too. I've written about it. So starting on the question of the nationalization of policy, I just want to start by establishing some of the facts. So the basic story is that the correlation between state legislative voting, and this is true for local voting where it's partisan as well, and presidential voting is increased very substantially over the last 40 years to the point where it's in the high 90%. That is to say, if you vote for Joe Biden, you're going to vote for a Democratic state legislator. And if you vote for Donald Trump, for a Republican. And the result of this is that it almost doesn't matter what actually happens in state legislature for general election outcomes. That is to say, the state legislatures could, it's not entirely true, but they could run around naked all the time and it wouldn't matter which party wins the elections. I hope they don't. I've seen them. But while there are a lot of differences inside parties, ideological, especially in places big as California, What this means is that voters don't get the tool or don't rely on a tool that is where you have parties that are allied along national issues or kind of presenting things along state issues to help people vote in state elections. And so if all the competition is happening in primaries or in California in the weirdo jungle primary system that uses, not my term, that is the technical term, I believe. It's probably shouldn't be, but the information that's available for voters on the issues that divide Californians is just not that high. And the people who have access to information are pretty different from your average person. That is to say, if you know the differences between two state legislative candidates voting in California, both of whom are Democrats, you're probably a weirdo, right? Like you're not like
pay really close attention.
Yeah, right, exactly. You might be a member of a homeowners group in local elections, or you might be someone who's particularly allied with one interest group or another. Basically, the effect of this is to reduce the influence of what I call mass politics. That is to say, the ability of ordinary people to lend their voice in state and local politics. Why we've seen this increased nationalization is a couple of factors, but one of them is definitely the decline of local newspapers. Where local newspapers close, we see a sharp decline in split ticket voting. It's pretty clear. We also see, by the way, another amazing effect that's related to this. Borrowing costs for local government go way up. So if your local newspaper goes out, you then go out for a loan from the bond market, your borrowing costs go way up because the bondholders know that no one is watching these politicians anymore, right? So they can do whatever. And so what could we do to make this better? I've got a couple of ideas that I mentioned in other work. One is we could subsidize local newspapers. And I think we should do that. Local newspapers it would pay for itself and reduce borrowing costs, among other things, but also would be good for democracy. Another one is we could create tools to make it easier for people to know things in local elections. Chris Elmendorf and I, who's out in San Francisco, have written a couple of things that are California specific, some of them about this. But one of the ideas, you could have the mayor, local elections, have the mayor make endorsements for city council. So the idea would be that it would be very clear to voters who know who the mayor is. Mayors are often, you have out-party elected mayors, and mayors are generally held accountable for outcomes. You would make it clear whether a supervisor, in your case in San Francisco, are allied with the mayor or against the mayor. And that would make it easier for voters to know who London Breed is, but don't know who, I don't know, Dean Preston is, to figure out whether Preston is opposed to the mayor as he is or with the mayor. And so that would help. Another one that's a little more radical, if you're interested in some crazy ideas, Elmendorf and I offer some crazy ones too, which is you could allow interest groups of a variety of types to make endorsements on the ballot. So that is to say, voters come in to vote in a primary. I have no idea who anyone is. But if you saw on the ballot Sierra Club, Gimby, whatever, allied with people, and you would have qualification efforts for doing so, that would allow voters to triangulate a little more and be able to learn more about local politics through on-ballot endorsements. Of course, groups can make ballot endorsements off-ballot, but nobody really knows. I mean, some people do, but you have to, again, be a weirdo in order to...
We do. We get a big booklet with stuff in it in California.
You read it?
I do. Yeah.
I know. Well, you're a weirdo. Exactly. I don't mean to be critical, but it's just not the case that most people have the time or effort, even people who can come out to vote, which again is itself not the entire population or even the entire voting age population or even the registered population. And then in California, of course, to vote, you have to figure out, you say it's a big booklet because again, you have to vote
It's huge, yeah.
You have to vote on
Prop A, B, C, D, E, F, G.
Yeah. Information costs for people are just extraordinarily high. I will say that the moving of the elections to November in even numbered years and in presidential years is like a huge, huge gain. There's a lot of evidence, for instance, in school district elections that holding elections off cycle leads to higher teacher salaries, which is a fascinating finding. But the basic idea is that teachers unions are more effective in elections when the turnout is lower. So Sarah and Zia at Berkeley has shown that this effect is pretty robust. And holding elections on cycle, I mean, you can think what you want about higher teacher salaries, but Zia's finding is suggestive that where more people vote, you get substantively different outcomes. You also get different outcomes by kind of money devoted to different neighborhoods. That is to say, you get more minority turnout in general elections than you do in off-cycle elections. And the effect of that is that more money goes to, or more equal amounts of money go to areas that have minority populations.
Was there something in the research for the book that made you rethink prior assumptions about budgets, about states, about cities?
I mean, one of the things about writing a book is that you What's prior to the writing of the book is not clear. I mean, I've been writing this book for, give or take, and working on things for 8 years. So, I mean, I've been doing other things in that time too. But, I will say one thing that became really apparent to me, and I think it's one of the things the book does that prior books don't, is something you mentioned, which is treating courts as policymakers in this area. So the idea of courts, and this is something that's like lawyers would spend a little more time thinking about, but it became really apparent that in a number of these periods, courts are worrying about the trilemma very directly. And sometimes that's through kind of common law decision making that the Supreme Court was doing in the 1870s and 1880s. But also sometimes we just assign it to courts. So in our bankruptcy process, one way to think about what municipal bankruptcy is, in a lot of ways, is saying we're going to give some man or woman in a robe the power to decide whether a jurisdiction is insolvent, which is a really complicated question. But one way to think about what they're doing is deciding, has jurisdiction cut enough that we're going to allow it to make creditors take haircuts? Your favorite word there. And so one question to ask about is like, why give courts this role? It's kind of weird. Judges aren't trained financial policymakers. They're not, depending on where they are, they're not democratically responsive. And I think a lot of it is that people, despite everything, all evidence to the contrary, and there's a lot of evidence to the contrary, give courts a great deal of social respect to deal with these situations. And so I think the role of courts is one situation in which my thinking definitely evolved over the course of writing the book.
Is there a question that you wish you were asked more?
That's a great. I wish I was asked that question more. No, I would say that one of the challenges of this book is that it doesn't provide a clear roadmap what to do in every crisis. And so I'm going to ask what question I was asked less rather than what I was asked more. Maybe I'll try to, while I think about the answer to your much better question. One of the things that people ask is so if Chicago is bankrupt, what should we do? And I have some second order things, which is if we're going to do bailout, then we should do these following. But I don't have a fundamental answer to that question of bailout, austerity, or default in all situations. And that's because the world changes over time. It depends on situation quite a lot. And so one of the things the book, it isn't a cookbook. It's a set of options. Sometimes people ask, what should we do? Or alternately, is the MTA going to go bankrupt tomorrow? And I frequently I dissemble and go blah, 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 blah when people ask those types of questions. Now, a question I wish I was asked more is a question that a bunch of people have raised with me recently, but I found really generative, which is one of the underlying premises of the book is that state and local governments have to borrow money. We rely on state and local governments to borrow money. And why do we do that? Well, I argue, following some work in the political science literature, that it's because Congress can't do infrastructure investment. That basically from the first Congress, Congresses have had a lot of trouble targeting infrastructure investment to real problems. They spread the money out in a pork barrel sort of way. Every district gets a little. And as a result, they recognizing that they're going to do this and that it's hard to know from Washington what Walla Walla Washington needs, they just give money to state governments through block grants or through the interest exemption on municipal debt, and then let state and local governments do the infrastructure investment. And a lot of people have pushed me recently saying, well, wouldn't it be better if the federal government just did a lot more? There are a lot of problems created by state and local investment. A couple of things that are created is, among other things, you noted the transit cost problem. Well, one plausible reason why it's so expensive to build transit in America, tunnels, rail in America, relative to France, is that it's done through this kind of Rube Goldberg system of a lot of governments involved. No one knows who to hold accountable. Wouldn't it be better if the federal government either did more or did less? That is to say, maybe they shouldn't be involved at all. We shouldn't have transit grants. We should stay out of it. Maybe take over Medicaid. Another version is maybe for targeted important national infrastructure projects, we should have the Army Corps of Engineers do it. And this is a really challenging question because there would be a lot of benefits to national taking over of certain infrastructure. But there will also be a lot of costs, particularly that, again, the informational problem is a real one. It really would be hard for a bunch of bureaucrats in Washington to know what local roads to build. And also, there's a lot of evidence that infrastructure investment, particularly if you look at the infrastructure investment of, say, the turn of the last century, why was the US so much better than other countries? Well, in other countries, you kind of had to ask London or ask Berlin if you wanted to build something in Birmingham or in Bonn or whatever. Whereas in Buffalo or St. Louis, you didn't have to ask anybody, you just did it. And we're able to rely on this kind of rich resource of the municipal bond market to fund you. And I think that that's pretty attractive still. But I do wish, the way I'd square the circle a little bit is I wish the federal government would do a lot more research into how to make infrastructure investment better. So we mentioned briefly talking about the investment into the kind of research that's been done into transit costs, but we really just don't know a lot about why it's so expensive to build transit in New York. We know some facts about it, but we don't know a lot. And we don't really know why. There's some great research by Zach Liskow and Leah Brooks on why the cost of building highways has increased so much in recent years. But the federal government should do a lot more to help us learn something about infrastructure. And I think that would be an attractive solution.
We talked about this on a previous show, and I can't remember who was on, but basically there's so many things that you could possibly do. And maybe it was Yonah Freemark. But one of the things I think that the highway departments around in states have over transit authorities is that they have so much more history of doing this stuff. And they get so much more money for research from the national academies to do all these NHCRP reports and all those things. And so there's a kind of a rich history of research about how to do this road. This mix of concrete is best for this type of drainage system, et cetera, et cetera. But we really don't have that for transit, for building subways, which if you had that expertise because of that research, it would be a lot better.
Be a lot better. I agree. But I mean, the funny thing about it is even with all the money we spent on research on highways,
it's still going up.
It was only a couple of years ago that people discovered things like interstate highways have gotten a lot squigglier over time. It used to be that they'd run straight between cities, and now they do a weird, funny pattern in order, it seems, to avoid lawsuits by angry residents who don't want the highway to run through their area. The state of research on infrastructure really broadly is just really lousy. I mean, not to say there aren't great people doing it. There are. Some of them are my closest friends, but there ought to be a lot more. And I also think with the highway stuff, a lot of the findings are, let's just say, more ideologically inflected by the belief that the goal should be more throughput of cars. And that's the one thing you should be studying than other thing. And if you don't buy that, then a lot of the research is, worth the paper it's written on. I mean, it is the most professorial thing to say in the entire world. The solution to our social problems is giving more grants to professors. So, I apologize for that.
No worries. We had Greg Schill and Jonathan Levine on to talk about that recently too. So
to be fair, I also called for more subsidies for local media, which I would extend to podcasts and email newsletters. So there you go.
I'd appreciate that. I would totally appreciate that. That's what I'm trying to do, is try to share information with people so they have more to make decisions on.
As you know, I am such a fan of your daily email dumps. I effectively assign it to all of my students. I say that any student who's interested in this needs to become a subscriber immediately. I don't know what the uptake has been. Maybe I'm less influential with my students than I would like, but I do always encourage it because it's such a great resource for people to learn things about transportation and land use and a variety of what's happening.
Thanks so much. So where can folks find the book if they want a copy? In a Bad State, Responding to State and Local Budget Crises.
It's at bookstores everywhere. And by bookstores, I mostly mean Amazon. But it's it's in some bookstores too.
You can order it from your local bookstore is what we always say. So
you can order it from your local bookstore. You can order it from Oxford University Press. You can order it from Amazon. Just order it.
Awesome. Well, David, thanks for joining us. We really appreciate your time.
Thank you so much for having me. This is a blast.
And thanks for joining us. The Talking Headways podcast is a project of The Overhead Wire and published first at Streetsblog USA. Thanks to our wonderful Patreon supporters for sponsoring this week's show and Mondays at The Overhead Wire. Find us at patreon.com/TheOverheadWire. And you can sign up for our 16-year-old newsletter at TheOverheadWire.com. And you can also listen to our show on your podcatcher of choice, including Spotify, Stitcher, SoundCloud, iHeartRadio, and Apple Podcasts. And if you can't find it there, you can always find its original home at usa.streetsblog.org. We'll see you next time at Talking Headways.